My in-laws ruined my baby shower, but then my MIL found out I was having twins and tried to ambush me at the hospital. When my husband heard what they did, he made a decision that left everyone asking for forgiveness. The day of my baby shower started like a dream, a crisp, sunny morning full of promise. I'd woken up early, eager to celebrate this milestone, surrounded by family and friends who would share in the joy of my impending motherhood. Everything was ready, a delicate pastel theme, a table laden with finger foods and desserts, and an atmosphere designed to be intimate and warm. But as I stood in the shower venue, taking a moment to breathe in the calm before the event began, a black SUV pulled up outside. The storm had arrived, my mother-in-law. She swept into the room with the force of a hurricane, her voice carrying over the soft music as she barked instructions to no one in particular. "These decorations look bare," she declared, waving her hand dismissively at the carefully arranged floral centerpieces I had picked out. Without asking, she began unpacking boxes filled with gaudy, oversized baby-themed decor she had brought with her. Out came balloons shaped like baby bottles, banners that clashed with my pastel palette, and a towering diaper cake wrapped in bright blue ribbon. "Where do you want this?" she asked, holding up a glittering banner that read, "Welcome, Grandma's Little Prince." It wasn't a question, it was a proclamation. I didn't even have time to process my irritation before she ordered one of her sisters to hang it prominently over the dessert table. I forced a smile, trying to keep the peace. Actually, I was hoping to keep things simple. "Oh, nonsense," she interrupted, patting my arm like I was a child who didn't know better. "This is my first grandchild. We have to make it memorable." Her first grandchild. As though this moment, this day, wasn't about me or my baby, but about her newfound role. Guests began to arrive, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that the chaos would settle. But I should have known better. My mother-in-law was in her element, working the room like a politician at a campaign rally. She greeted every guest, my friends and family included, with dramatic declarations of how excited she was to meet her grandchild. She had a knack for making everything about herself, and today was no exception. When it was time for the gift opening, my side of the family presented thoughtful, heartfelt gifts, handmade blankets, a scrapbook for baby memories, and a set of carefully chosen books to start the baby's library. My mother-in-law sat front and center, barely containing her disdain. "That's cute," she said, holding up a beautifully embroidered onesie my aunt had made. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she added, "But don't worry, we'll handle the big stuff." The room fell silent for a moment, and I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. My aunt's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, offering me a warm look of encouragement. Then came my in-laws' gifts. They had pooled their money to buy an extravagant stroller and car seat combo, items I had already picked out and placed on my registry. She announced the gifts as if she had saved the day, ignoring the fact that her generosity had rendered other people's efforts redundant. "You don't need to worry about any of this," she said smugly, looking directly at my mom and sister. "We've got it covered." I clenched my jaw, struggling to keep my composure. This was supposed to be a moment of joy, a celebration of the new life I was bringing into the world. Instead, I felt like a guest at my own party, watching helplessly as my mother-in-law commandeered every aspect of the event. The final straw came during the toast. My best friend stood to say a few words, her voice warm and emotional as she spoke about how excited everyone was for me to begin this journey into motherhood. She raised her glass, and before anyone could respond, my mother-in-law stood up and began speaking over her. "Thank you for that lovely speech," she said, cutting my friend off mid-sentence. "I just want to add how proud I am to become a grandmother. This baby is going to be so spoiled and so loved. And don't worry," she added with a wink, "I'll be there to show you how it's done. New moms have so much to learn." The room erupted in polite laughter, but I felt the sting of her words like a slap. She wasn't just hijacking the toast, she was undermining me as a mother before I'd even had the chance to begin. I stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. My husband, bless him, caught my eye from across the room and gave me an apologetic shrug. He knew his mother was overbearing, but he had no idea how to stop her. By the time the shower ended, I was utterly drained. Guests trickled out, offering hugs and congratulations, but I could barely muster the energy to thank them. My mother-in-law, meanwhile, was already packing up the leftovers, loudly declaring which dishes she'd be taking home. As she walked out the door, she gave me a kiss on the cheek and said, "Wasn't this just perfect? We should have more parties like this when the baby comes." Perfect. That was the word she used to describe the event she had hijacked, the day she had turned into a showcase of her own ego. When the last guest left, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding all day. My mom and sister stayed behind to help me clean up, their supportive presence the only thing keeping me from breaking down. "You okay?" my mom asked gently as she folded one of the tablecloths. I nodded, though my throat tightened with the weight of everything I hadn't said. "I just wanted one day to celebrate this baby without her taking over," I said finally. "Just one day to feel like this is about me." My sister wrapped an arm around me. "Next time, we'll make sure it is," she promised. But as I looked at the remnants of the party, the garish decorations and half-eaten food, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time my mother-in-law overshadowed me. If this was how she behaved before the baby was even born, what would happen when the baby actually arrived? I didn't have an answer, but one thing was certain: I would have to find my voice, and soon. The weeks following my baby shower felt like a much-needed reprieve from the chaos. I threw myself into preparing for the baby, finding peace in the quiet joy of folding tiny onesies, arranging the nursery, and daydreaming about what life would look like once the baby arrived. It was a time of sweet anticipation, and it gave me space to focus on what truly mattered: my growing family. But amidst all the preparations, I held on to a secret that made every flutter of a kick and every ultrasound photo feel even more special. During a routine appointment weeks ago, my doctor had smiled and turned the monitor to show not one, but two tiny, flickering heartbeats. I was having twins. When my husband and I found out, we were floored. Excited, overwhelmed, and terrified all at once, we decided to keep the news private for a while. This was our moment, and we wanted to savor it without interference, especially from my in-laws. I could already imagine my mother-in-law swooping in with unsolicited advice about raising twins, taking over every decision, and turning it into her triumph rather than ours. So, we stayed quiet. The people closest to me, my mom, my sister, and my best friend, knew, but no one else. It felt like a treasure I could hold close to my heart, something pure and untouched by drama. Weeks passed, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. My husband had been extra supportive, helping me set up cribs and assemble baby gear while dodging my mother-in-law's constant check-ins. She had a knack for calling at the worst times, always under the guise of just wanting to help. "Have you thought about names yet?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with faux sweetness that barely masked her impatience. "Because I was thinking, if it's a boy, you could honor your father by naming him James. Isn't that nice?" "We're still deciding," I'd reply, biting my tongue to keep from pointing out that my father-in-law had never even hinted at wanting his name passed down. Despite her constant prying, she had no idea about the twins. I felt a sense of relief every time we got through a conversation without slipping up. But my mother-in-law was nothing if not persistent, and as I would soon find out, her knack for inserting herself where she wasn't wanted knew no bounds. It happened during a family dinner. My husband and I had reluctantly agreed to visit his parents for the evening. I knew it was important to maintain some level of connection, but every time we entered their house, I felt like I was walking into enemy territory. The evening started innocently enough. My mother-in-law fussed over the meal, making sure everyone commented on her world-famous lasagna, while my father-in-law flipped through the TV channels, only half listening to the conversation. My sister-in-law made her usual sarcastic remarks, and my husband kept a watchful eye on me, sensing my unease. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way back, I passed the living room, where my husband and mother-in-law were deep in conversation. They didn't notice me at first, and I paused just long enough to catch the tail end of her probing questions about the baby. And the nursery? You're not doing that trendy minimalist thing, are you? Babies need stimulation, not plain white walls, she was saying, her voice laced with judgment. We're doing fine, Mom, my husband replied, his tone tight but polite. I shook my head and kept walking, deciding it wasn't worth the headache to engage. As I reached the dining room, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at it to find a text from my mom, asking how dinner was going. Smiling at her impeccable timing, I typed a quick reply, MIL is in rare form, but the twins and I are fine. I hit send without thinking, but as I tucked my phone away, a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see my mother-in-law standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me. What was that? She asked, her voice sharp and suspicious. I froze. What was what? You said something about twins, she said, stepping closer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but before I could respond, her face lit up with realization. Oh my God. You're having twins, aren't you? Her voice rose, and before I could even confirm or deny it, she clapped her hands together and spun on her heel, heading straight for the living room. Everyone, she announced, her voice carrying through the house. They're having twins. I felt my stomach drop as I followed her into the living room, where my husband sat with a horrified expression. My father-in-law looked up from the TV, mildly interested, while my sister-in-law laughed and said, well, that's a game changer. Mom, my husband said, standing up. That wasn't your news to share. Oh, don't be silly, she replied, waving him off. This is wonderful. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I mean, twins. This is huge news for the family. I stood there, frozen in a mix of anger and disbelief. Her giddy excitement wasn't about the babies, it was about her ability to seize the moment and make it hers. We wanted to keep it private for now, I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Her face fell into a mock expression of hurt. Private? From family? Don't be ridiculous. We would have found out eventually. That's not the point, my husband said, stepping in. You overheard something that wasn't meant for you, and instead of giving us a chance to share it on our terms, you made it about yourself. My mother-in-law's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Well, it's out now, she said, brushing him off. And it's great news. I can't wait to start planning. Twins are going to need double of everything, don't worry, I'll handle it. That night, I lay in bed replaying the scene over and over in my mind. I should have been happy, the twins were a blessing, and their impending arrival filled me with joy. But my mother-in-law's intrusion had tainted the moment, leaving me feeling robbed of something sacred. As my husband wrapped an arm around me, he whispered, we'll handle her. She's not going to ruin this for us. I nodded, grateful for his support, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. My mother-in-law wasn't done, and I had no idea what she would do next. The day of my delivery was a blur of emotions, anticipation, anxiety, and exhaustion all swirled together. Giving birth to twins was no small feat, and my body felt every bit of it. The delivery had been long and grueling, but when it was over and I finally held my two beautiful babies in my arms, all the pain seemed worth it. They were perfect. Tiny, fragile, and completely mine. I was still adjusting to the overwhelming reality of being a mother when the nurses wheeled me into my recovery room. My husband sat beside me, holding one of the twins while I cradled the other. The room was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of our newborns. I finally felt like I could exhale. But that peace was short-lived. It started with a knock on the door, polite but insistent. My husband frowned, gently placing the baby in the bassinet before going to answer. Through the small crack in the door, I heard muffled voices. At first, it was hard to make out the words, but then a familiar voice rose above the rest. I'm her mother-in-law. Let me in. My stomach dropped. Before my husband could shut the door, she pushed her way inside, flanked by a small entourage of family members, her sisters, my father-in-law, and even a cousin I barely recognized. They weren't just visiting. They were invading. The twins stirred at the sudden commotion, their peaceful slumber disrupted. My husband turned to me, his face a mixture of shock and frustration. "I'll handle this," he said quietly, his tone more a promise than a statement. My mother-in-law wasted no time making her presence known. She marched into the room, her gaze immediately fixating on the babies. Her face lit up with a kind of possessive glee that made my skin crawl. "Oh, look at them," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "My grandbabies. Aren't they just perfect?" She didn't ask if she could hold them. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't even acknowledge me lying in the bed, pale and exhausted, still recovering from surgery. Instead, she moved straight to the bassinet and reached for one of the twins. "Stop." My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let her treat my children like trophies to be paraded around. She froze, turning to look at me with a mixture of surprise and indignation. "I just want to hold my grandchild," she said, as if that justified everything. "You didn't ask," I replied firmly, clutching the blanket around me. "And you're not supposed to be here." Her expression darkened. "What do you mean, I'm not supposed to be here? I'm family. We have a right to see the babies." At that moment, my husband stepped in, placing himself between her and the bassinet. "Mom, this isn't the time," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "She just went through a tough delivery. She needs rest. You need to leave." "Leave," she repeated, her voice rising. "Are you serious right now? This is my first time seeing them. I'm not going anywhere." Her voice grew louder with every word, and soon, the entire floor could probably hear the argument unfolding in my room. The babies began to cry, their tiny wails adding to the chaos. "Mom, please," my husband tried again. "You're upsetting everyone, including the babies." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she turned to her entourage for backup. "Can you believe this?" she asked, gesturing dramatically toward us. "They're keeping the babies from us. Us. Their own family." The nurses arrived shortly after, drawn by the commotion. One of them, a petite woman with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped into the room and addressed my mother-in-law directly. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice," she said firmly. "This is a hospital. Other patients are trying to rest." My mother-in-law's face turned an alarming shade of red. "I'm the grandmother," she snapped. "I have every right to be here." "Actually," the nurse replied coolly, "visitation is at the discretion of the patient. And the patient has made it clear she needs rest. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, I thought my mother-in-law might argue, but the weight of the nurse's authority, and the growing number of curious eyes peeking out from other rooms seemed to deflate her. She turned back to me, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I'll go," she said, "but this isn't over. We'll talk about this later." With that, she swept out of the room, her entourage trailing behind her like a defeated army. When the door finally closed, the silence was deafening. My husband sat beside me, running a hand through his hair. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "It's not your fault," I replied, though the tears stinging my eyes told a different story. "But I can't do this. I can't keep fighting her for space in my own life." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "You won't have to," he said, his tone resolute. "This was the last straw. She's not coming near you or the babies until she learns to respect our boundaries." I wanted to believe him, but after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if even he could keep her at bay. As I held my twins that night, I couldn't shake the lingering tension in my chest. This was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life, but my mother-in-law had managed to turn it into a spectacle. Her sense of entitlement had eclipsed any shred of consideration for me, her grandchild's mother. But as I looked down at my baby's tiny faces, a fierce sense of determination took root. They deserved better than this chaos. They deserved a mother who could stand her ground, even against someone as relentless as my mother-in-law. This wasn't just about protecting my recovery. It was about protecting my family. And if that meant drawing hard lines and enduring more drama, so be it. My babies and my peace were worth it. The hospital room was still, save for the occasional soft cry of one of the twins. I sat propped up against the pillows, clutching the edge of my blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring me. The echoes of my mother-in-law's earlier tirade still rang in my ears, the entitlement, the accusations, the sheer audacity of it all. I glanced at my husband, who sat slumped in the chair beside me, his head buried in his hands. He looked like he'd just gone 10 rounds in a boxing ring. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice muffled. When he finally looked up, his eyes were heavy with guilt. "I should have stopped her sooner. I should have done something." I shook my head, too drained to muster anger toward him. "It's not your fault she's like this," I said quietly. "But something has to change. I can't do this anymore. I won't." For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze shifted to the bassinet, where our twins slept peacefully, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. Then, as if something inside him clicked, he straightened in his chair, his expression hardening. "I've had enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We're setting boundaries, and if they can't respect them, they don't get to be part of our lives." The certainty in his tone took me by surprise. This was a man who had spent years trying to appease his overbearing mother, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. But now, something was different. He wasn't just speaking for me, he was speaking for us, for our new family. That night, we talked for hours, laying everything out in the open. Every slight, every boundary his mother had bulldozed, every moment she had made about herself instead of us. For the first time, I saw my husband fully acknowledge the damage she had caused, not just to me, but to him as well. "She's always done this," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "She pushes until she gets what she wants, and I just let her." I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until now. "Well, it stops here," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Not just for me, but for the twins. They deserve better than this." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll call her tomorrow." The next morning, true to his word, my husband picked up the phone and dialed his mother's number. I sat nearby, pretending to focus on the twins while my heart raced. Part of me wanted to eavesdrop, but I also trusted him to handle it. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension that hung in the air. "Mom," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." I couldn't hear her response, but I could imagine it, the immediate defensiveness, the refusal to acknowledge she'd done anything wrong. My husband pressed on. "Your behavior yesterday was completely unacceptable. You didn't ask if it was a good time to visit, you brought a crowd into a hospital room without permission, and you caused a scene. That's not okay. You crossed the line, and it's not the first time." There was a pause, and then he said something that made my breath catch. "Until you can respect us as a family, you won't be seeing us, or the twins." I froze, my hands tightening on the edge of the blanket. Even though we'd discussed this the night before, hearing him say it out loud was a shock. This was the same man who had spent his entire life trying to avoid conflict with his mother, and now he was drawing a line in the sand. The conversation dragged on for several more minutes, punctuated by his calm responses and what sounded like increasingly frantic protests on her end. Finally, he said, "I hope you'll take this seriously. But until you do, we need space." And then he hung up. When he turned to face me, his expression was a mixture of relief and sadness. "It's done," he said simply. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the day, our phones were flooded with calls and messages from his extended family. Some were angry, demanding to know why we were punishing his mother. Others were more manipulative, trying to guilt us into reconciling. "She's just excited about the twins," one message read. "You should be grateful she cares so much." "She didn't mean any harm," said another. "This is just how she is. You know that." But the worst were the messages from his mother herself. They alternated between pleading and accusatory, shifting blame with every text. "I don't understand why you're doing this to me," one read. "I'm your mother. I deserve to see my grandchildren." Another said, "This is all her doing, isn't it?" followed by a thinly veiled jab at me. Despite the onslaught, my husband stood firm. Every time he saw me start to crumble under the pressure, he reminded me why we were doing this. "This isn't about keeping her out forever," he said one evening, holding my hand. "It's about making her understand that things have to change. If she can't respect us, she can't be part of our lives." I nodded, though part of me still struggled with the weight of it all. Setting boundaries with someone like my mother-in-law felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a sandcastle. But for the first time, I felt like we were a united front. Weeks passed, and the messages gradually slowed. My mother-in-law eventually stopped calling, though I suspected it was less about acceptance and more about sulking. Mutual family members continued to play peacemaker, urging us to reconcile, but we stuck to our decision. In the quiet that followed, I realized just how much of a toll her presence had taken on us. Without her constant interference, we could finally focus on being parents, learning how to care for the twins, navigating sleepless nights, and savoring the precious moments of their early days. For the first time in what felt like forever, our little family had room to breathe. One night, as I rocked one of the twins to sleep, my husband came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. "I know this hasn't been easy," he said softly. "But I'm proud of us. Of you." I smiled, leaning into his embrace. "It's not easy, but it's worth it," I replied. "For them, it's worth it." As I looked down at the tiny face in my arms, I felt a surge of determination. We had taken the first step in reclaiming our peace, and while the road ahead might be rocky, I knew we were stronger for it. This was our family, our life. And no one, not even my mother-in-law, was going to take that from us. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a new kind of normal. The twins grew stronger and healthier, their little personalities starting to shine through. The days were long and exhausting, but they were also full of joy, moments of quiet bonding during late-night feedings, tiny giggles that made every sleepless hour worth it, and the overwhelming pride of watching them grow. For the first time, I felt like we were truly a family, free from the shadow of my mother-in-law's chaos. On the other side of this piece, my in-laws had been forced into silence. After my husband's firm decision to set boundaries, there had been no dramatic follow-ups or attempts to storm our home. At first, the quiet felt like an uneasy truce, as if they were regrouping for their next move. But as the weeks stretched into months, it became clear that something had shifted. It started with a text message from my mother-in-law. I almost didn't open it, wary of what she might say. Was it another veiled accusation, or perhaps a dramatic plea for attention? I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Finally, curiosity won out, and I opened the message. "Hi. I know I've hurt you, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that happened. I was wrong to push so hard, and I'm truly sorry for not respecting your boundaries. I miss you all, and I hope we can start fresh." I read the words twice, then a third time, unsure if I could believe them. This wasn't the defensive, self-serving rhetoric I had come to expect from her. This was an apology. A real one. I showed the message to my husband that evening, unsure how to respond. He read it silently, his face unreadable, before handing the phone back to me. "She's never admitted she was wrong before," he said finally. "It might be worth giving her a chance." I nodded slowly, though a part of me still felt hesitant. Forgiveness is complicated, especially when trust has been broken so many times. But I knew that holding on to resentment wouldn't help us move forward. If she was willing to make an effort, maybe I could, too. We agreed to a meeting, neutral ground for our first interaction since the hospital ambush. My husband chose a small cafe, far from the kids, to avoid any potential dramatics. As the day approached, my nerves tightened, a knot of anxiety sitting heavy in my chest. I had no idea what to expect. When she walked into the cafe, she looked different. The usual air of confidence she carried had softened, replaced by something quieter, almost tentative. She sat down across from us, fidgeting slightly as she waited for us to speak. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice subdued. We exchanged pleasantries at first, skirting the real issue, but eventually, she took a deep breath and began. "I owe you both an apology," she said, her eyes flicking between us. "I let my excitement get the best of me. I crossed lines that I shouldn't have, and I didn't think about how my actions affected you, especially you," she added, looking directly at me. I didn't interrupt, letting her continue. "When you set boundaries, I felt like you were shutting me out, and instead of respecting your wishes, I made it about me. That was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry." Her words were careful, but they felt genuine. I glanced at my husband, who gave me a slight nod, his face softening. After a long conversation, we agreed to give her another chance, but with conditions. I laid them out plainly, my voice steady but firm. "There are rules," I said. "Visits are by invitation only. No surprise drop-ins. And when you're here, you respect our parenting decisions. If we say no to something, it's no." She nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. I just want to be part of their lives. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." It was a start. The first visit was cautious. My mother-in-law arrived on time, carrying a modest gift for the twins, a set of books and soft blankets. There were no grand gestures, no attempts to dominate the space. She kept her tone light, following our lead as she interacted with the babies. It felt strange at first, like we were navigating uncharted territory. But as the afternoon went on, I found myself relaxing. She didn't overstep. She didn't make it about her. For the first time, it felt like she was genuinely trying. Of course, rebuilding trust wasn't a smooth road. There were slip-ups, times when her old habits threatened to resurface. During one visit, she made a comment about how the twins needed more stimulation because our nursery was too plain. I shot her a look, and she quickly backtracked. "You're right," she said, catching herself. "I'm sorry. You're their mother, and you know what's best." It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Over time, things began to shift. She started asking instead of assuming, offering help without pushing her own agenda. Slowly, I started to see glimpses of the relationship I had always hoped for, a grandmother who loved my children but respected their parents. My husband's unwavering stand had forced her to confront her behavior, and to my surprise, she had risen to the challenge. She still had her moments, but the change was real. One afternoon, as I watched her gently rock one of the twins to sleep, I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected, gratitude. For all her flaws and missteps, she was making an effort. And that effort mattered. I wasn't naive enough to think everything would be perfect from now on. Boundaries would still need to be enforced, and trust would take time to fully rebuild. But for the first time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Forgiveness is messy. It doesn't erase the past or undo the hurt, but it creates space for something new, a chance to heal, to grow, to do better. My relationship with my in-laws would never be the same as it was before, but maybe that was a good thing. We weren't going back to the way things were. We were building something healthier, one boundary at a time. And for that, I was grateful.